If we can agree on the second chapter of the Genesis, God plants two trees in the middle of a garden. One of the trees produces the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. God commands the man and the woman living in the garden not to eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or else they would be doomed to die. The man and the woman disobey God, but rather than death, their punishment is banishment from the garden. The question that remains is, what is the fruit? The story gives us three clues that might identify the natural identity of this fruit. The first clue would be that it's a fruit. This reminds us that it comes from a plant. This reminds us that it was something that was eaten, or something that was ate. The second clue depends on how you read the text. In particular, the knowledge of good and evil. Now there's three ways to read it. You could read it as there was the knowledge of good, and evil was some separate abstract. The second way to read it would be that good and evil are almost fused together into one abstract idea. But the final way to read it was the way that I chose in identifying the profile of this fruit. And that was, it was the knowledge of good as well as the knowledge of evil. So that being our second clue, we have that it was a fruit, that it was a fruit that gave the knowledge of good as well as the knowledge of evil. And finally, our third clue was the reaction that the man and the woman had upon eating the fruit. And that their eyes were open and they knew they were naked. Now, I recently reinterpreted how I read that sentence. I was standardly reading it that their eyes were open to the fact that they were naked and they knew they were naked. But after looking at the fruit again and thinking that it was the knowledge of good and evil as well as the knowledge of evil, I consider that they were two separate reactions, one being the knowledge of good and the second being a knowledge of evil. One was a reaction to the knowledge of good, the second was a reaction to the knowledge of evil. So their eyes were opened and they knew they were naked. Now, I wanted to derive a term for the knowledge of good as well as the knowledge of evil based on the reactions. Now, for me, their eyes opening was something that was very telling because an eye-opening experience is something that we know in modern terms. Now, eye-opening is something that is enlightening, we might consider that it makes us smart. But at times it has another sensation that we would consider sobering. Not every eye-opening experience is pleasant. So the term that I chose seemed to be one that was consistently showing up over and over again throughout other stories. And the term that I felt best identified eyes opening as far as the reaction was wisdom. In terms of it was something that made you smart as well as something that was you reacted to soberly. So the man and the woman eat of the fruit and they become wise. Not in a grand sense, but the beginning of wisdom. Now the second reaction they had, in a sense of knowing evil, would be that they knew that they were naked. And the reactions that we get is that there was shame, there was a sense of remorse, the term that I chose for knowing naked was guilt. I chose guilt because I feel that this would be the most modern interpretation, modern word that we could use for knowing evil. If we would measure what we know to be evil in terms of guilt, not simply that we know about it, but we could also know it in an active term. In the actual act of committing the crime, we are knowing something is evil. In this term, since they knew it after the fact, that they knew that they were naked, or they were learning that they were naked. So there was a sense of a guilt, a guilty conscience, is something that we would use in modern terms. So if we can agree that knowledge of good could be we could use the word wisdom, and for the knowledge of evil, we could use the word guilt, based on the fact that the man and the woman had eye-opening experiences, and they knew that they were naked. They were enlightened and they were shamed. We would derive a fruit not of the knowledge of good and evil, but a fruit of wisdom and guilt. If the knowledge of good is wisdom, and the knowledge of evil can be measured in terms of guilt, we now have a fruit of wisdom and guilt. And we now have to answer, what is a fruit of wisdom and guilt? How would we know a fruit of wisdom and guilt? This fruit might come from a family of fruits known as the poaceae, or poaceae, which are the fifth largest member of plants on our planet. They have 12 subfamilies, or 12 tribes, and we most commonly know them as large or tall grasses, such as bamboos. Bamboos would be a member of this particular type of family. I don't know which subfamily, but the second might identify it as well, the Caryopsis, which is a botanist term for a simple type of dry fruit, or a simple dry fruit. What was particular to Caryopsis were the varieties of these types of fruit, which we commonly know as wheat, corn, rice, oats, barley, sorghum, millet, rye. And the reason why these varieties are of interest to me was because they don't represent staple crops of society during ancient times, as much as I believe or would argue that they represent society itself. There was no expansion into society, or what we would consider a city, until we had these large agricultural movements that were based on one of these varieties of plants. Corn in the Americas, rice in the East Asias, millet in India, in Africa, and then wheat obviously being very, very relevant and prevalent within the many books. Now, in general, since these represent so many different varieties of fruit, we would most commonly know them under one word, or one fruit, or one type of fruit. And that would be grain. Grain being the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this can't come without any proof, so we would have to ask, how would we know grain to be the fruit of knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil? So we would have to ask ourselves, how would we derive wisdom from grain? Well, the actual tangible product that we would consider that might represent this abstract idea of wisdom that you can derive from grain essentially are for its oils. These being, I believe, enriching. Oil obviously being something that we associate with wisdom, or for its purposes in terms of anointing, or the products that we come to know. Also from grains. How else do we use grains? Well, they make our bread, noodles, flatbreads, being tortillas, like naan bread, as well as just eating it for the product itself, rice. The question is, as we continue with the separate products that these make, that we know today in most common terms, do any of these stray from the idea that we would know them to be wise or connected with wisdom? Would we say that we've seen representations in modern terms between bread and the abstract thought of, or idea of wisdom? Noodles with wisdom, eating rice with wisdom. From ancient times to now, would we know these products to be wisdom, as well as considering that for the most part of our age and occasional, our lives, we've been presented with the idea of a food pyramid with the most largest member of that recommended allowance coming from the breads and cereals. Cereals being another one. Do we consider that eating these products would make us smarter, enrich, or enlightening, or would we say that we would get them for their oils? All of these words, would we say could be represented as terms of wisdom? Possibly. But on the other hand, can we derive guilt from these products? Well, if we can naturally derive oils from these products, they're also known for the fact that we can derive alcohol from these products. In terms of, what are these type of products? Obviously, whiskey, wine, beer. Are these all products that we would associate with guilt? In our guiltiest pleasures, do we consume alcohol? So from this one particular fruit, which has had a very broad impact on our society from the beginning of time till now, we have a fruit that both produces wisdom and guilt in terms of the oils and the alcohol that it produces, as well as making products for us that we would consider to be both wise and guilty pleasures, or wise and guilty representations. So based on this, I would say grain is the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Now obviously I feel